Good afternoon, Monique.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you? Thank you.
Good. We're going to just welcome everyone and give a couple more minutes before we get started as people continue to enter the webinar. And so we're excited to be here this evening and to see who comes to hear our new community conversation.
Yes. Looking forward to everyone coming in soon. Welcome. Welcome. My name is Monique Marshall-Veal. I'm the Director of Special Projects for the Urban Ministry, and we're glad that you are all here with us.
And I am glad as well. So we can begin with this evening's presentation. Again, I welcome you and we welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministries, a monthly community conversation. My name is Mary Margaret Earle. I am the Executive Director and the Senior Minister of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry. For those who are new to us, we are located in John Elliott Square in Roxbury, and a part of our campus includes the building that's known as First Church in Roxbury. The Urban Ministry, over our 190-year history, has done many different things. And in 2021, the three basic things that we do are provide services and programs to survivors of domestic violence, including a shelter and a workforce development program. We provide after-school programming to high school students from Boston, and as part of that, cultivate an appreciation for history and train some of the young people to be tour guides to lead historic walking tours of the neighborhood. And finally, we also bring the arts and humanities and lectures and community building onto our campus. So the conversation that we're having this evening is the kind of event that we would usually highlight in our historic meeting house, Boston's oldest surviving wood frame church building. And we would have that discussion in that space. Tonight's discussion is equity in education, a very important topic today, and of course, a longstanding topic of importance. But since we can't gather in our meeting house, we have begun these conversations in person. So we're gathering this way to keep the conversation going.
And to talk a little bit about the community conversations, as Mary Margaret said, we do miss being able to hold these kinds of events in our space, but we are hopeful that we will be able to gather in person again soon. Our community conversations really focus on highlighting the history, the art, and the experiences of Black and Indigenous people of color. These conversations provide an opportunity to raise awareness around some of the issues that tend to plague the residents of color in our Boston neighborhoods. Many thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to you joining us again in March as we celebrate the history of Page Academy and its wonderful founders, Reverend Joe and Dr. Angela Cook. So thank you again.
Thank you, Monique. Yeah. So this evening, our order of events is that we'll begin our show with a commercial. We have been developing our own commercials to highlight Black-owned businesses in Roxbury. Tonight, we're proud to show a commercial featuring Soleil Restaurant in Nubian Square. And then we'll have the main event with historian Mr. Joseph Feaster. I want to thank this evening's sponsors, Alan Cody and Edith Moritz. Mr. Cody is a board member of the Urban Ministry, and Alan and Edith are great champions of racial and social justice. And one of the ways that they're expressing that commitment to justice is by sponsoring this evening's community conversation. And we thank them for their support and all that they do in the service of making a world more fair. So thank you. And now we're going to share with you our commercial featuring Soleil Restaurant in Nubian Square. We hope that you will see this restaurant and support it, get takeout there, buy gift cards there, and when we're all vaccinated, to go out and actually eat there. So happy to share this commercial with you.
Hello, my name is Chef Cheryl. I own Soleil Restaurant. We are located at 2306 Washington Street in the heart of Nubian Square, which is in Roxbury, Mass. Soleil is named after my granddaughter, and in French, soleil is the term that is used for the sun. We have an amazing menu. We have a phenomenal breakfast with many different omelets, pretty cool pancakes, and we have a lot of Southern cuisine. Ours is kind of Southern with a twist. So that might mean our seasoning. For example, in our collard greens, I used smoked paprika. And in our mac and cheese, I will put a little bit of cilantro. It gives it just a little pop. So when we say with a twist, we add our own funky ingredients. We are open Monday through Friday from 8 in the morning until 3. Then Friday evening, we reopen from 5 until 9. We can be found at soleilboston.com. Soleil, like many other restaurants, are asking our guests if they could go on our website and order from us and perhaps pick up. That saves us in delivery fees. However, if you do need it delivered, we do have a number of ways to get you a Soleil meal. Thank you for the opportunity to share who we are and what we do here at Soleil.
We very much hope that you will support Soleil Restaurant and all the businesses in Nubian Square and Roxbury. Now it is my great honor to introduce to you Mr. Joseph Feaster for this evening's discussion. Mr. Feaster, Joseph Feaster Jr., an attorney for more than 44 years and a community leader, has always been engaged in public and community service. He is a graduate of Northeastern University and Northeastern School of Law, and since 1998, he's been counsel to the law firm of McKenzie & Associates in downtown Boston. He serves on the board of directors of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts for the past 5 years, and he has been chairman since October 2017. He previously served as vice chair and chair of the Development Committee. He also has served as president of the Boston branch of the NAACP and was president when the National Association's convention was held in Boston in 1982. He's chairman of the board of Dimmick Community Health Center, vice chair of the board of Neighborhood Health Plan, and speaker of the House of the National Association of Community Health Centers, to name just a few of his engagements. Mr. Feaster is married to Phyllis Feaster, and he has a daughter, Alana, a late son, Joseph, and a grandson, Jaden. And he also likes to bring attention to the fact that, like his son, Joseph III, he also is an organ donor. I am so proud and honored to welcome Mr. Joseph Feaster. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary Margaret. Monique, I am so humbled and delighted to be able to be present with all of you this evening. I want to thank Bithia, who I first spoke with regarding this sometime last year, and certainly want to thank Nora, who has become my new friend as the technician behind the scenes, trying to keep us all on point and on record. And I think I started out by not following her direction because I probably came on sooner than she anticipated. So Nora, just know I get in trouble at home about that as well. So there is nothing different than what I customarily do. So you're just gonna have to bear with me for this hour and a half.
And thank you for acknowledging those behind the scenes people who are making this possible. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Welcome.
Very much so. Thank you. And there's nothing wrong with good trouble, as Mr. John Lewis has told us. So we appreciate that. Thank you. So Mary Margaret shared a lot about, or a snippet of your history and background. And could you talk to us a little bit about how you got involved with the NAACP and the Urban League, and what drew you to that work?
Well, thank you for that question, Monique. And I think I was on and had a conversation with Dr. Charles Anderson from Dimmitt Community Health Center, the new CEO, president and the CEO there. He was on a program this morning. And like him, I both, from a standpoint of my faith and my upbringing and from home. And so I want to start a little, I want to give a little background and history. I always tell folks here, notwithstanding the fact that I've been in Boston 53 years, I am truly a native New Yorker, born in the Bronx, raised in Queens, worked in Brooklyn. And I came up here in 1967 to attend Northeastern University. And I consider myself a beneficiary of the civil rights movement. So just like that, what John Lewis said, it applied at that time back in 1967 when I came up here. I grew up in the era of Dr. King. I grew up in the era of Cheney, Goodwin, and Schwerner in 1964. I grew up in 1965, the Voting Rights Act. So, I was here on the campus of Northeastern University at the time in 1968 when Dr. King was assassinated. Mm. So I came out of an era of civil rights and activism and was active on the campus at Northeastern University. Let's fast forward. My involvement with the NAACP, because I spent much of my time when I first came up here being a young 17-year-older on the campus, dealing with campus, organizing with those who were organizing the different institutes of color or African-American institutes on the campuses around Boston. Later served on the steering committee for what is now the John D. O'Brien African-American Institute. And so took that activities into involvement with the Boston branch of NAACP. And how I became involved was in 1974, the school desegregation began in Boston, in the Boston Public Schools. And at that time, there was much strife and turmoil that was taking place. And the then president, my predecessor, the late Thomas Atkins, put out a call to law students to come so they could come take the complaints because they needed to present to the court the types of protection. And for you all are probably too young to have been involved to know about all of the buses and all of the things that were going on and what was going on at South Boston High and Hyde Park High and Charlestown High at that particular point in time. But I was a second-year law student in 1974 and heeded the call to come to the branch in order to participate with other law students in taking these complaints. And in fact, wound up heading up that particular effort of organizing all of those law students and personally taking that ride up the hill. And if you've never taken that ride up to what I call the gauntlet, up to South Boston High, to the high school, you can imagine a young child, 9th grader through 12th grader, going up there with people hanging out the windows on rooftops, yelling at them, banging at them, calling every name but the child of God, and going into what they supposed to be an environment where they supposed to learn, fighting in the classroom, fighting in the hallways, police in there. And in fact, I'll just say as an aside, my wife graduated from South Boston High and was there from 1974 in 1974 and 1975. So that's what started my activities. I stayed around with the branch, became a board member at an election in 1977, and Tom Atkins, the then president of the branch, became the general counsel for the national. I was the first vice president, and I then acceded to the presidency of the branch and served as president from 1979 to 1983.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. Knowing the importance of the NAACP and the Urban League during the civil rights time and even today, when you joined those organizations, what would you say were the most pressing issues they were working on, and who were some of the colleagues that you were able to work alongside to accomplish some of that work?
Thank you very much, Monique. I'm going to draw a parallel later on, but I've learned early on, answer the question that you asked. So that's what I'm going to do first. I'll draw the parallel in a moment. As I commented, as far as what introduced me into becoming involved with the Urban League, with the NAACP, was an educational issue. We were talking about the desegregation of the Boston public schools. Now, that effort started well beyond my direct involvement during that time in 1974. While I had been in Boston, I was on the campus primarily, but there were persons like Paul Parks, Ellen Jackson, Ruth Batson, Elma Lewis, Melnia Cass. These were Hubie Jones. These were the persons who originally filed the lawsuits in the late 1950s, talking about the desegregation, filed a lawsuit against the then school committee, a 5-member school committee, because arguing that schools in the Black community were not getting the funding and the benefits with the schools, the Boston public schools in the white communities. That was the lawsuit that was filed in the late 1960s. So that was the lawsuit. That's the lawsuit that Judge Garrity heard and made his ruling and desegregated the schools. Now, 2 other things happened, and I know we're going to talk about it later. We're going to talk about it later. And let me just move this phone. We're going to talk about it later, is we're going to talk about Metco. We're going to talk about Metco because that came out of that as well, in terms of what we call one-way busing was to take place. And so that's what, those were some of the persons, along with Tom Atkins, along with Kenneth Guscott, and the Guscott family. They all were involved with some of the people that I were associated with during that time, along with the law students that I referred to from the law schools in the area who participated in taking those complaints in 1974. And I will also add, I think, regrettably, we just learned that she had passed, but Doris Bunty was a board member with me during that time frame at the NAACP. So what you had is you had folks at either the NAACP or the Urban League, and I'll talk about the Urban League as like Mel King, who was the executive director. All of these names you're going to find, we were intertwined in the activities of trying to do what was best for the Black community during that time period.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm wondering, Mr. Feaster, we talked about, when we publicized this event, we also described you as an historian. So you've been a civil rights activist and an advocate for justice, but you also bring a historical perspective. So I just wonder if we could step back for just a moment. And could you talk a little bit about sort of the origins or the roots of the Urban League and the NAACP in Boston, and give us a bit of a historical perspective about how they came to be?
Thank you very much, Mary Margaret. Certainly, and this is where I was thinking about drawing the parallels, because we see what we're going through in this country right at this present time. And I draw a parallel to the last 5 years to Reconstruction in the latter part of the I guess that would be the 19th century, where in the late 1890s, when the Ku Klux Klan and the Jim Crow laws and all of these laws were passed, which really were the genesis or the reason or the rationale for the creating of both the NAACP and the Urban League. And because of all of those atrocities that were taking place in the late 1890s during Reconstructions, they had attempted and very successfully to undo any of the gains that were made after the so-called freeing of slaves and what transpired post-Civil War. We know what we heard about the then President Johnson. We know what we've heard about Woodrow Wilson and his activities as related to trying to disenfranchise Black people during that time frame in the early part of the 20th century. And so as a result of all of that ferment and discord that was taking place, both the NAACP and the Urban League were started. Now, the NAACP started actually grew out of an organization called the National Negro Committee, which started in New York City in 1909. 1909, they had a meeting up here, in fact, in Boston, and Boston was the epicenter for a number of things, as we know, with regards to the Revolutionary War, we know with regards to these efforts here. So again, this occurred in Boston in 1909. They had a meeting in New York in 1910, and that's when they changed the name from the National Negro Committee to the NAACP. And then they came back in their second convention, if you will, and that's when they formalized the Boston branch of the NAACP in 1911. And interesting enough, if folks don't know the history, the organization was formed by whites and blacks that were here. The first president of the Boston branch was Moorfield Story, who was white. There were members, Butler Wilson. There was the family, the Pillsbury family, and the Morgan family, who were very, very rich whites that lived here in Massachusetts. William Monroe Trotter was a board member at the time in 1911, and then it was family, the Garrisons. So what we had this history of in terms of, forward thinking and progressive and whites who formed with progressive thinking blacks at that time frame, formed the Boston branch NAACP and proceeded to try to address the issues that were confronting them at that time, much like it's being done here. And I always try to tell the young people, they think that there's new organizations that are being created, that the organizations such as the NAACP and the Urban League are no longer necessary. Well, I'll give you an example, just jumping ahead to the present.
Please, yeah.
Just read today that the NAACP has joined with a Representative Thompson out of Mississippi to sue Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, I call them the poor boys, they call them the Proud Boys, but I call them the poor boys, and the rest of them for that insurrection using a Ku Klux Klan act. So the NAACP will always be engaged and involved with all of our chapters across the country. So that's my promo for the NAACP, as still continuing to be relevant and engaged and involved as we go here into the 21st century. Now, the NAACP throughout its history, if you go through 1930s, 1940s, just want to read some of the things that happened and some names that people may have. I mean, they were there for issues involving Sears, Roebuck in terms of people's jobs and employment. And I just look for people to read. I don't want to spend the time of trying to read with my eyesight is not that good to read all of this material again, but some of the memories, if they start to look at, they fought for people for jobs. They talked about people getting the proper wages for when they were serving as housekeepers and maids. For seamstress, they were making sure that people were able to work in some of the hotels. All of these were battles that the NAACP engaged in from that time in the early 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, as or they fought for whatever the rights were. And people need to understand as well the history. Remember, Black folks didn't start in Roxbury. Black people started in the West End, and then up on Beacon Hill, and then I'm trying to think in terms of areas skipping me right now, but in terms, and then Lower Roxbury, and then in terms of Roxbury. So So we migrated to where we are now in terms of which is really looked at as the epicenter of the Black community being Nubian Square. We didn't start there. And so if people begin to look at the history, they'll understand that as far as what took place in Boston. But for instance, 1948, the first woman to head any branch in the NAACP was a woman named Florence LaSure. The fourth annual convention of the National Association of the NAACP, the 41st annual NAACP convention was held here in Boston in 1950. There are names such as John D. O'Brien, who served both on the school committee, of which the African American Institute at Northeastern is named after. He also was one of the first vice presidents at Northeastern University. He also taught a program for over at Dimmock Community Health Center. So these are names that you have. The Melnia Cass. Melnia Cass was the second woman president of the branch and increased the membership to nearly 5,000 people in 1962. So these are all names. We have streets named after some of these folks because in terms of the contribution that they made. This is when, in 1965, when I talked about the lawsuit, as far as what was then called the Racial Imbalance Law, which resulted in the court-ordered desegregation of the Boston Public Schools and the creation of MEDCO. So education was always one of the pillars and one of the activities of the NAACP, not only locally, but also nationally. Issues such as I talked about jobs. They brought lawsuits against General Dynamics Corporation in 1966. Once again, Boston held the National Convention here in 1967, the 58th National Convention for the NAACP nationally. And as I pointed out, we had the convention here in 1982 as well. And so that has been our history of that, and education, the lawsuit, the desegregation of the schools, the filing of suits against the city of Boston and HUD around housing. We dealt with issues of police brutality and some of the cases around that. Personally, during my tenure as president, we had, if some may recall, the circumstances with Levi Hart, who a young boy that was shot. We had the Atkinson case, a person chased on the red line and was killed. So we've dealt with these issues over and over and over. So education was our mantra, jobs was our mantra, fighting for people's right in order to make fair wages. These are always the history of the NAACP. And then lastly, what I found out was, I said, well, what will possibly Mary Margaret or Monique ask me here? I went back and looked at it from its inception in 1911 until the present time. There have only been 31 presidents of the Boston branch. I was the 19th. Tanisha Sullivan is now the 31st. So from 1911 until the present, that's what we have as far as there's only been 31 presidents of the branch. So that's the history of the NAACP. And now I just will overlay with that a history of the Urban League, and you can start to see the parallel and the interconnectedness of people who were engaged in the activities. And one of the principles that I've held regarding having served in both organizations, I see NAACP as the advocate. I see the Urban League as the program and business, because we want to get train people in order to get jobs and to develop businesses. So that's the separation. And yes, both for civil rights organizations, but I think our ability to work together in most of the cities that we are involved in. I see Tanisha Sullivan and NAACP, let them raise the types of issues. We will support those types of issues because we are concerned, as I'll point out with the history of the Urban League, but we say they should take the lead in raising those particular types of issues. And when once you've gotten them settled on how they're going to be responsive to those things, then bring it, and we programmatically will try to implement the things that are necessary to be done at the Urban League. So we work with that type of compatibility. Well, again, the Urban League was founded, the Boston Urban League was founded in 1919.
1919, you said?
In 1919, on May 16th, 1919.
So just a few years after the NAACP.
That's correct. In terms of now, the national, had started before that, but in terms of here in Boston, it was started, and the first board chairman was a gentleman named Robert Theo Payne Jr. And the first, and it was really an organizer called Eugene Nickel Jones, who came from the National Urban League, who really came here in 1917 in order to begin the process of forming Urban League here in Boston. And it wasn't even called, it was called the Boston Urban League. It wasn't the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts as is known now. It was the Boston Urban League. And I'll talk about some of the people who did serve in the capacity as that for that organization. And just to give you a sense of how both the NAACP and the Urban League worked in parallel, one of the persons who formed both the Urban League and was involved in the formation of the Boston branch of the NAACP was a gentleman named Butler Wilson. And you'll see him throughout the history in the discussions of both those organizations of having been involved in its formation and the activities that were taking place around there. The Urban League, as I said, looked at building with jobs, trying to get people prepared for work, and we still do that to today. We have our workforce development. We have programs which are trying to prepare people for, as we say, jobs of the 21st century. So we have coding jobs and things of that nature that are in there. We used to have a mature workers program working with elder adults who want to go back into the workforce. We're going to be looking at now, because they do it nationally, and we hope to, under the leadership of Dr. Keith Motley, who is our consultant, president, and CEO, and his team, and with William Watkins, who is the director of workforce development, to begin to do some things working with our youth. I'm very committed to what we're doing with our returning citizens. That for those who don't know, returning citizens are persons who have previously been incarcerated, and we want to be able to find ways, because most instances they're coming back to our community, and we want to make sure that we can assist them both in terms of jobs, assist them with their quarries, to get them in a position whereby they can become reintegrated into the society in such a way that they can do it in a way where they don't have to have the recidivism and returning to back to prison. So we're looking at all of those things. Well, the Urban League has two auxiliaries. The branches, the Urban League branches, are called affiliates, as I'm always corrected by the guild president, because I always think NAACP and I call them branches, but we're affiliates. And we have both the Young Professional Network, which are persons under 40, and we have the guild, which are persons 40, and we have a member now that's 103 years old, and I'm sure she can outdance all three of us. And they provide programs and activities for those respective age groups, and also are supportive of the affiliate, which is the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. And I just wanted to just give people some semblance of, beside the programmatic pieces, well, before I do that, in terms of talk about some of the people who have served in those capacity with the Urban League, that names that they may know, I just want to point out as well, today, as we've done for several months in the past and will in the future, we have had what we call leaders over lunch. So we've had discussions about topics of the days with persons of the day who are carrying out things which we as Black and brown people need to address, whether it's political, whether it's organizing, whether it's fundraising, whether it's education, whether it's assessing what has transpired over the politically over the past 5 years and its impact on us, whether we should be discussing reparations. So we want to bring the conversation and the discussion to a point to have it, and then to move towards action. And that's what we are doing, and we continue to have that. In May is Urban League month, and we're going to be having a series of activities that are engaging there as well. But I wanted to there are some names that people may know, and then I'll stop there and let you question me. But our first president of the Urban League back in 1919 was a name named Matthew Bullock. I'm not sure that if he was related to, I didn't do the history check, to the Bullock family, because it was a Bullock funeral home that's here, in Boston. It could very likely have been a relative. I just don't want to make that claim here, but it may be worth someone investigating, and maybe someone in chat will inform me. Edward Cooper, to show you the connection. Not only was he a president of the Urban League, but he was executive secretary of the Boston branch NAACP at a point in time as well. Mel King, everybody knows Mel King, state representative, community activist. He was a president of in fact, it was called, as I said, the Boston Urban Committee or Urban League. It wasn't called the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts at that time. We had Representative Shirley Owens Hicks. She was the Urban League president at the same time when I was president of the Boston branch NAACP back in 1979 through that period to about 1983. She was the president of the Urban League. Dr. Joan Wallace Benjamin, who served as the president and CEO for about 10 years, and also the Home for Little Wanderers, and still involved doing some work with us now, because once you're an urban leaguer, you are always an urban leaguer. Just like Dr. Motley, once you get it in your blood, you're going to be coming back, and that's what Dr. Joan Wallace Benjamin did. Barbara Edlin, who was involved with the Roxbury Comprehensive Community Health Center, and also her husband, Dr. Edlin. She was very much, and she served as president. And then immediately before Dr. Motley, who is our consultant president and CEO, Dr. Keith Motley, the Chancellor Emeritus of UMass Boston, is serving in that capacity since last October, was Darnell Williams, who served for nearly 20 years as the president and CEO of the Urban League. And then there are a number of presidents of the board. They were called then, now we're called chairman. And there was, I mentioned Robert Treat Payne, who was our first, but the great jurist, late jurist, Harry Elam was the president. Charles Grigsby, who was very much involved and served with the Public Facilities Department's director. The Honorable Joyce London Alexander, who was one of our magistrates in the federal district court. Samuel Gerson was the owner of Filene's. George Russell, who was an executive vice president at State Street Bank. Richard Taylor, who is a developer here, my fraternity brother and line brother, was also a chairman of the board. Jeffrey Mussman, who was an attorney here, served as a chairman of the board. Quincy Miller, who was the chairman of Eastern Bank, was and is still involved as a chairman emeritus. He and Jeff Mussman and Richard Taylor and George Russell. I told you don't get away with the Urban League. And then Andrea Kershaw, who was with Enterprise, the car rental company, was my immediate predecessor, and then myself. So we have an array of people who have been involved, and I just mentioned those names. I could go into at the appropriate time the Guild presidents and the YPN presidents, but I'm going to turn the program back to you, Mary Margaret, and to Monique.
Thank you, Mr. Feaster, and thank you for that both broad view but also detail in the background of the NAACP in Boston and the Urban League. And I'm sure some of those names are really familiar to the folks who are listening here, and interesting to hear them contextualized. One thing that I wanted to hone in on a bit more is for you to talk a little bit about, you referenced the segregation, desegregation, busing, the trauma that the young people experienced and sort of going through that up the hill, or what you described as going I can't remember the name that you used to describe that experience of that climb.
Oh, the gauntlet. Going through the gauntlet, yes.
Yeah, but I wonder if you could just, kind of help make it really, you have a lot of background and history and knowledge, including firsthand knowledge, but for some folks who are listening, they only have, a very vague sense of what some of the issues were that impacted young people of color in Boston to gaining equity and equal access to education. Can you try to help make that real for us listening and watching about what was happening? What were some of the real barriers to equity in education? What were some of the fights that the NAACP and Urban League were involved in to try to reshape that? What was some of what you saw in your time in terms of that struggle?
Well, I would have to harken back to that period I mentioned earlier with the Racial Imbalance Law, and I have to speak about all those sheroes and heroes that were involved at that time, and I'm going to mention them here. I may have mentioned them already, but it is noteworthy to mention them here with the question that you've asked me, Mary Margaret.
Mm-hmm.
We had the Ruth Batsons, Elma Lewis's, the Snowden, the Paul Parks, the Ken Guscotts, the Tom Atkins, the Ellen Jacksons. These are all the names that people know from Operation Exodus that took place, because the discussion at the time was the school committee in Boston was not giving the resources to schools in the Black community, and folks said enough is enough. We want our children educated. This was called, Boston was considered up South. And so folks came here, migrated from the South in order, thinking that this was going to be the land of opportunity and change. This was the bastion of, in terms of, we had the William Monroe Trotters, we had we had the oratory that was taking place at the Faneuil Hall. So this was the place we had the first person killed in the Revolutionary War. So this was to be the place where slavery was not supposed to take place, that equal opportunity in education, where they found out that just wasn't so. So in 1965, they filed that, in terms of the lawsuit that I referred to, that resulted in both the desegregation of the Boston public schools in 1974 and the creation of Metco. Now, some will criticize Metco because they said it was only one-way busing. So it wasn't a situation we're trying to do, because the whole issue back then was integration. And because it was believed that integration would result in better education. Now, in many years, we can have a discourse around that, and I'll leave it to others, and this is not the time to have that, but that was the conversation and the impetus that took place at that particular point in time, that integration would do that. So when Judge Garrity looked at it, and I'm sure that some of the discussion was going to take place, those families weren't going to send those white kids to come into Boston to go to school, to a school system which they felt was inferior. So what they said, okay, if we're going to integrate, we'll take these Black boys and Black girls and send them to suburban towns in order to get what was expected to be a better educational opportunity for them. Ruth Batson was the first director of Metco. Gene McGuire is another name that you will know, was the immediate past director of Metco. Gene served for many, many years, served on the school committee when it was a 5-member school committee. She and John D. O'Brien both served on there. And I can't recall the person's name that's there right now, who is the head of METCO. I know her because she worked with my wife at ABCD, and I do apologize, but senior moments do come in, and so blame it on my mind and not my heart that I can't recall the name right now and it may come to me. But nonetheless, that was the vision for the creation of METCO. I am familiar with METCO because both my late son Joseph and my daughter went to METCO from first grade all the way through high school at Newton at Newton's in the Newton schools. From the well, my daughter went to Memorial Spalding. That it later was Oak Hill, and then Memorial Spalding, and then Newton South, and then Brown, excuse me, was the middle school, and then up to the high school. And they were on the south side, so Newton South. And I will say, my children's experiences for educationally were sound. Their interactions in the town different for a Black boy versus a Black girl. So there were those issues to have to deal with. The fact that have to put them on the bus at ungodly hours in the wintertime. It's dark outside. Well, dark outside when they left for school, dark when they came home from school. Mm-hmm. So those types of things. So they had to take the buses. So that was the experience that were there in the various towns, and the relationships of the METCO students to the METCO towns varied throughout. There were some that there were great relationships and families were supportive in many of the towns. And in other towns, there were horror stories that were reported from time to time. One of the things I will try to dispel, the towns weren't doing any financial favor because the dollars for the student followed the student to the school that they went to. So it wasn't a situation that this was a handout from the towns that were METCO towns. What it did was, in Judge Garrity's mind, and I met Judge Garrity during this time, he felt fervently that this one-way busing was the appropriate way to proceed, and that was the order that he gave. And when we do our retrospective on METCO, we can have a discourse.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. And it was put in the chat that the executive director of METCO headquarters now is Millie Thomas.
Millie, and Millie, I do apologize. I know really well. I do apologize, Millie. Thank you, whoever answered the question.
Linda
Freeman did. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
And she would forgive you, I'm sure. So listening to you talk about the constant fight and thinking about where we are today, I guess there are some people who, find it hard to believe that we're still fighting for educational, equity right now. And knowing that there were some really tough moments that you all faced in those fights. Can you talk a little bit about, some of those hard moments, and how did you kind of find moments of hope and, the ability to not give up and to know that your fighting was going to be worth it?
Wow. I'm glad you asked easy questions, Monique.
I thought that was easy.
Yeah. I guess it really comes down to each individual. My personality is, and a lot of the people that I'm engaged with now actively, we're never going to give up. I'm not going to give up on the struggle. I'm not going to give up no matter where I sit in terms of job-wise, government-wise, financially-wise. I am not going to give up on what I believe are things which we rightfully should have. And I'll say right here on this, I'm a reparationist. I say, and I don't know how I'm defining that, but the only thing I will say is, I'm owed 40 acres, but I want 41 because I have no use for the mule. I don't know how to use it. I don't know how to ride it. So they can keep the mule, just give me 41 acres. But we are owed, we built this country. We've been here over 400 years. And as far as I'm concerned, yes, there have been advances, I mean, if you look at the horrors that people experience in those 400 years, yes, we have to say our circumstances are better, but have we reached the nirvana? That is definitely not the case. And we know that from the Federal Reserve study, which talks about $247,500 a white family, $8 in a black family. So no, we haven't reached nirvana. Are we talking about our, as you can see, what's going on now in terms of the trying to do the disenfranchisement in terms of the voting? That has been something historic, and a lot of deferment that took place over last year. And not last year, but quite frankly, last month, which took place because folks didn't want Black and brown people to be able to exercise and consider their vote as being valued. So the need to recognize that we need to stay in the struggle is something which drives me and drives the people that serve with me, both in the NAACP and the Urban League and other organizations. That's not the only place where I'm engaged with people, with My Brother's Keeper, with folks like Thaddeus Miles and Conan Harris, and with the Wise, with James Morton and the Boys and Girls Clubs, with Andrea Swain and with Catherine at the Roxbury Y. So we're trying to do all of our pieces, but we're trying to do some of these things. We do try to support each other collectively in order to get things done. And so, yeah, sometimes you get tired and you really want to go. And I tell folks, yeah, I want to, it's like running a relay race. I want to pass the baton on to somebody, who will take over a leg of this race. I run, when I ran track, I ran relay, and I would run my leg and then someone else had to run the next leg. I don't want to run the whole 880. I don't want to run the entire distance. I want others in there. And that's what I'm trying to pass on to our younger generation, to say you got to get engaged in this game because the struggle is not over. So to answer your question, Monique, I think it's more in the sense of visceral. You got to have it in your heart in order to be able to know that you want to stay in the, that you're going to participate in the struggle, because the struggle will continue. And that's evidence. What transpired on January 6th, unprecedented. I never would have thought it would happen. I studied, I had to pull out the Constitution and reread it. I studied it in law school. We talked about it in law school. I learned about the First Amendment. I learned about the Second Amendment. I learned about, the articles. I had to go back and read it and say, well, is that what this said or did not say, did not allow? So that shows me that the issue has not changed. How are we going to have people who are going to believe in someone who practice misogyny and practice in terms of racism, and still hold them up, and 70 million people can still support that. So you can't tell me that the struggle is over when we are still faced with some of the issues that we have. We still have issues in terms of our young people still not being able to be educated. We are seeing evidence by what's going on with the COVID-19 and with the situation in terms of the health disparities that are taking place. We're seeing the disparity in terms of the distribution of the vaccine. We see it in the terms of people that affirmative action was created in 1975 and dead in 1976. So what I'm saying is we have to stay in the struggle because the fight is yet won.
Thank you.
Thank you
for that.
Thank you.
We have time for just one more question from me and Monique before we have a commercial break and then come back to let the audience ask some Q&A. But I wondered if you could say just take a couple of minutes to say, what are the most pressing educational issues in Boston right now? And what's the biggest challenge right now facing the challenge for educational equity?
My wife, who was a retired Boston public school teacher, told me, stay out of educational issues. And Mary Margaret, you just going to get me, you have room at your house? You have room at your house? But okay, I don't think there is any single issue that is facing from the standpoint of the educational, from my perspective, the issues with education in school, public schools, period. I've always defined the relationship with the schools. The schools to operate are what I would say four legs on a chair. There are the administrators, there are the educators, there are the parents, and there are the students. And unfortunately, the chair legs aren't equal. And so if you don't have, you try to sit on a chair that doesn't have equal length in terms of the legs of the chair, I think the chair is going to topple over. And that's my metaphor for what's happening in the educational system. There's not an accountability, and maybe I'm biased because I'm around educators. I'm married to an educator. That I see the burden seems to be put on the educators to deal not only with the educational aspects for the young people, but also the social issues that are around it. So they're social workers, they're educators, they're responsible for all of that. And I don't think there is sufficient support within the system for the job that they do. And that's the reason why, we're faced with a situation in Boston right now that the number of educators of color is probably in around or less than when we started the desegregation case back in 1965, because the folks who were hired during that time frame have now reached the age of retirement or moved on, et cetera, and people aren't wanting to become educators. So I think that that's particularly in terms of one issue that is plaguing, and that's if we're just talking about the city of Boston. We're not even going to talk about the 351 cities and towns, what that may look like in terms of diversity. Then you have the situation, in my view, and this is only speaking from my view, that we talk about, well, we can't, folks, when I was growing up, I went to Catholic school, there were certain things, things were rigid, there were rules that were in place, there were things that follow, and maybe there were things that probably will not be tolerated at the present time, but nonetheless, there's no discipline, there's no accountability. So you can't suspend persons who aren't doing their job because they said there's too many suspensions, et cetera. So to me, there needs to be a reorientation in terms of the system that is in play as far as the type of educational environments that these young people are going to be able to learn in. And this has just been exacerbated by this coronavirus in the sense of both anyone trying to do their jobs, and parents are beginning to understand how rich and important these educators are, because what they have to now contend with and trying to educate maybe a number of their young people in different grades. They're with them 24/7 now, et cetera. So they're really beginning to see what it is. So I think there's a wholesale overhaul that may need to be done. But unfortunately, I'm not sure that there is the will or the resources in order to do that. And that's the reason why I know you mentioned that you're going to have great Dr. Page coming on to your program. I've been supportive of her and Brother Joe all these years. We've had the community schools that have taken place here as well as other places around the country. And maybe that's the direction. Maybe the direction that we had schools that came out of the South, when there were those one-room classrooms, maybe that's the answer. I don't know. I'm not an educator. And you've sent me down a path that I may not be able to travel back over. So I'm going to leave that for now and leave it for those who study the area and are more involved in it like a Dr. Motley, like a Dr. James Jennings, like our superintendent, and who would be able to give some insights into how we can better prepare our young people for the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr.
Yeah.
Feaster. Thank you. We see questions are already starting to pop in. So I think this would be a great time to just take our commercial break, and we'll come back and after we hear again from Soleil Restaurant, which is a wonderful restaurant in Nubian Square that we're inviting all those who are watching to support. You can go to the website right now and order some food and get some gift cards. And so we encourage you to support them. We'll be right back with Mr. Joseph Feaster Jr. for some more questions about equity in education.
Hello, my name is Chef Cheryl. I own Soleil Restaurant. We are located at 2306 Washington Street in the heart of Nubian Square, which is in Roxbury, Mass. And Soleil is named after my granddaughter. And in French, Soleil is the term that is used for the sun. We have an amazing menu. We have a phenomenal breakfast with many different omelets, pretty cool pancakes. And we have a lot of Southern cuisine. Ours is kind of Southern with a twist. So that might mean our seasoning. For example, in our collard greens, I used smoked paprika. And in our mac and cheese, I will put a little bit of cilantro. It gives it just a little pop. So when we say with a twist, we add our own funky ingredients. We are open Monday through Friday from 8 in the morning until 3. And then Friday evening, we reopen from 5 until 9. We can be found at soleilboston.com. Soleil, like many other restaurants, are asking our guests if they could go on our website and order from us and perhaps pick up. That saves us in delivery fees. However, if you do need it delivered, we do have a number of ways to get you a Soleil meal. Thank you for the opportunity to share who we are and what we do here at Soleil.
All right, welcome back. Welcome back. So we have some questions in the Q&A, and we have some questions in our chat. I'm going to start with one of the questions here from Claire, who says, my children grew up in Wayland and definitely benefited from METCO. What has been the impact of METCO on the overall quality of education in the Boston schools? Did the pressure for improvement decline because so many involved committed parents found better education in the suburbs? And she wants to emphasize that she does not mean to say that the parents in the METCO program made a poor choice.
Good question. That was a discussion that came up, whether METCO drained the academic cream of the crop into schools outside of the Boston public school system. To me, I can't answer that. What I think that any parent who made the choice to do that, if they were in a school which in Boston, which they felt was not educating their child, and they could find an opportunity just like any other parent would, then they made that choice. And so for me, it's there may have been those who may not either wanted to take advantage of it because of some of the negatives that I talked about. Having to get up early in the morning, it's dark, coming home in the winter when it's dark. But I would say, again, like this, the person who asked the question, I found that those sacrifices that my son, Joseph, and my daughter, Alana, had to make in order to go there to the Newton Public Schools were worth it because of what they were able to accomplish and achieve academically, educationally, as a result of that. So yes, I said, we could definitely have a debate, if you will, about whether MECO was something which was a benefit or not. But I think ultimately it'll come down to a personal choice and on each individual family for the choice that they made, whether to remain in Boston or not. And the question is, it would have been great that if you could get the same type of education that those at, say, Boston Latin Academy got, Boston Latin got across the school district, but we know that that just is not and was not the case. And so folks wanted to have their children educated. They made a choice, and that's the same conversation you're going to have about charter schools. I'm sure I looked in the chat in the Q&A. That's the same conversation that's going on. So I'm already, you know, the lawyer and me made me sneak and take a look there,
You're jumping
Mary
ahead.
Margaret and Monique. I already looked at the Q&A, but that's my answer to on the one for MECO.
Okay,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you. This is another question from the chat. And I'm wondering how the NAACP and the Urban League relate to the Black Lives Matter movement. If you could talk a little bit about that and their connection.
I alluded to that a little bit, Monique, when I was speaking about it, when I was talking about there are those who feel that, you know, that the old Lions organizations, the Urban League and the NAACP need to step aside because the new Lions are, you know, are there. All I see the Black Lives Matter as an extension of those organizations, because those organizations fought the same types of fights with the same types of folks for all those many, many years. The issues haven't changed. It's just that the players have changed, and I'm glad to see, because if you think about it, John Lewis was young at some point in time when he was engaged. When he was sitting at the counters there, he was a young man. When we had Sojourner Truth and all of them, they were young people who were doing some of the things that are talked about in Black Lives Matter. So I just see them as an extension, and I welcome their involvement. Personally, I say, I know of all of the Black people who were killed, particularly at the hands of police over the past couple of years. But I feel in my bones and in my heart that I call this the George Floyd movement, because it was those nearly 9 minutes which galvanized and focused the attention on the atrocities that were taking place. And that went across throughout, reverberated throughout the Black and brown communities and the white community to see exactly what was happening. So I do, and to be quite frankly, it was that moment which really moved the Black Lives Matter movement into the public purview, because they had existed for about 3 years, more or less in the shadow. They were out in Ferguson, but it really hadn't really spawned much beyond that. Upon the murder of George Floyd, they seem to grow and to flourish, and I think that they are strong, stronger now. So I welcome their involvement. They're the ones I want to pass that baton to that I spoke about earlier. I want to give them the baton to let them run that leg of the race, because I think it's their time in order to do that.
Thank you. One of our friends, Connie, says that she notices behind you the image of Ruby Bridges.
Yes.
And great to see. And I'll just mention that Ruby Bridges spoke at my son's college graduation at Rhode Island College a couple of years ago. But Connie wonders if you can say a little bit about Ruby Bridges and what's the meaning of that photo behind you, or the image behind you?
Well, you know, it seemed like it's, you know, everyone picked up on the educational theme, and that's exactly what that was. That was Ruby Bridges was the persons walking whose legs you see are the federal agents who had to escort her to school. She was at a white school. Right now escapes me in terms of exactly what state it was in. I think it was Mississippi, but I don't want to miscount that particular piece. But the image is, and the reason why I have it there is just as a reminder, this little Black girl had to be escorted to school by federal agents who had to stay at the school and escort her home because they didn't want this little Black girl to be going to school with little white boys and girls in that southern city. And and you know, that is happening to this day. You know, you may not need the federal agents, but there are children who are being forced to go to what has become segregated school systems, because even here in Boston, you can almost say the schools are becoming resegregated because the number of white students who attend the Boston Public School is de minimis at this present time. So yeah, this was an example of what transpired for Ruby, and I knew that she spoke at several schools this past year or in 2019. But yeah, that was again a time in our history that if we forget it, we'll make the same mistakes in the future. So I keep that as a reminder. I change out different pictures from different time, but this was one that I keep as a reminder at all, most of the time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And there is another question from Laurel. You mentioned that the NAACP was founded by both whites and Blacks.
Yes.
And wondering how that balance has evolved today.
Well, I can only speak for the Boston branch. If I can tell from my attendance at national conventions, predominantly, and now it almost seems to be percent Black. I know that there are persons and organizations and corporations that financially support the NAACP. I know when I was president, we had white members who used to be, in fact, Kivy Kaplan is a name that you may have heard of. A Jewish gentleman and his family were very, very supportive of the Boston branch NAACP and the New England Conference. And there are awards that were named after Kivy Kaplan, some of our local awards. We had a great involvement with the Jewish community, and I think I saw a name flash up here, Jordan Krasnow, who I believe I know Jordan, and again, I'm trying to draw upon memory. I think if it's the same Jordan Krasnow that I've known, who has been very, very supportive in a number of different ways, particularly when we were, on a personal basis, was involved with the late Lenny Zakem, who was the head of the Anti-Defamation League, who the bridge is named after, the Zakem Bridge, and his involvements. Well, we did a number of things together back in those times, 1979 through my time of 1983, with the NAACP and Anti-Defamation League. So I would say, Monique, in that answer that, and to the person who asked the question, that across the country, it probably varies from branch to branch. There are probably some communities where they may have white members, and there may be white members now, and we'd have to ask that of Tanisha Sullivan. But I can say to you that from the supporters of the NAACP, particularly financially, I think there still is activities and participation in that regard by folks across many ethnic backgrounds.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Jordan, he has two comments. He says, "Good to see you, Joe."
Okay, okay.
It's the Jordan you're thinking of, who's also a great friend of the urban ministry. He says, busing costs over $100 million in Boston. Given the demographics of the city, could the money be better spent?
I'm sorry, in terms of what the $100 million for, I'm sorry, Mary
Yeah,
Margaret.
it said busing costs over $100 million in Boston. Given the demographics of the city, could the money be better spent?
Boy, Jordan, I thought you were a friend. Why do you want to get, I said I should be talking about these educational issues, and here you are dragging me into one which has been, that's been I a hot stove, third rail issue. There are those who say, and you saw a number of years ago, I think they took away or stopped the busing of high school students. I think that occurred, my recollection is, so they did do that. They still bus students with special needs, and they do, I know the younger grades, they may even have stopped it for the middle school, but I know they stopped it for the high school. So I think that's some of what the addressing of the expenditure or the high cost of what the busing program was costing. I can't answer that because there are two things that come into play. We have enough problem in the sense of some of these students getting to the classrooms when they're being bused to them. How do you happen now when you're going to have them taking public transportation? Some people have to take 2 and 3 buses. There isn't the type of transportation that's there. We're not into community schools. So you may have a kid who lives in Mattapan who's going to East Boston for school. Does that, should that traversing all of those public transportations be a way in which to do that? Coupled with the situation, gangs. We have gangs from different neighborhoods and you traversing through there. So from a purely economic sense, and if my recollection is correct, Jordan is a developer. And so understand in terms of when when you're doing a structure, you look at the cost benefit analysis, you do the pro forma, and you put the monies where it's best going to be useful for the construction of your building. The unfortunate part is here, I would like to know, and even if the savings were made for the and not spent on the buses, and that would be laudable if we didn't need to have the buses that as youngsters were able to do as I did. I walked 3 blocks to my school, except for my high school, but from the 1st grade to the 8th grade, I could walk home. I can even go home for lunch and go back. Well, that's not the case now. So I don't know what the answer is, but I would say, let's have the conversation, Jordan. Let's get the superintendent in. Let's get the folks in. Let's get the school committee involved. And hey, let's have a discussion.
Thank you. So
I think Jordan's an attorney too. Yeah.
Yes.
all right. Thank you. So we have time for about 1, maybe 2 more questions, but this one question comes from a longtime supporter, David Harrington, and he states the advantages and disadvantages of charter schools have been widely discussed. Do you have a view about charter schools and on balance, good for the city and the children who may not have access to a decent education, or too big of a drain on the public school system? And I know it's another question about education, so you are probably going to have some makeup work to do, but go for it.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, and Valentine's Day is already passed, so the flower piece won't work.
It can continue.
I'll add to that question, and before I answer it, 2 things. One, I will say that that's almost like asking about the appointed versus the elected school board, but that's one hopefully the time runs out before I'm asked that question. And I just want to say hello because I know my daughter and my grandson, my daughter Alana and my grandson Jaden are on watching, so I just want to say hello to them.
Nice.
The interesting issue about the charter schools, and I put the charter schools into the same conversation that I did about MECO. It's individual choice. If persons feel that a charter school will provide their child with the educational opportunity that they want, it's a personal choice. Now, those engaged in public education see charter schools as piranhas, and that they're taking, because they're still considered public schools, they're getting the resources from and draining the public school system. So they aren't in favor of that. They also argue that charter schools aren't held to the same standard as they are, because charter schools don't have to be the school of last resort in the sense of taking any person who is there, who is by state law is at the age when they are required to be allowed a public education. Charter schools don't have to take that particular student. Charter schools don't have to keep a troubled student. So those who are involved in public education feel that charter schools are treated differently and unfairly. And I think the question there, and has been debated hotly, both at dinner tables and in school committee meetings, and certainly at the state legislature. And I would say point one to speak with Senator Sonia Chang Diaz, because she led the effort, which was to defeat the expansion of charter schools a number of years ago. So I think there's the argument on both sides as to whether charter schools are a bane, or are they something which is good for the educational system? And I'm going to leave that for others to answer that question, not me. I'll state the proposition as to what the issues have been, and what I've learned or heard the debate to be. But I think the jury is out. And to me, it comes from, there are two things. There's a policy consideration and there is an individual parent's consideration. And to me, what wins out for me is, how do I want my child to get a good education? And for me as a parent with a child, that's going to trump, no pun intended, anything with regards to any of the issues that may prevail.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we're going to ask we're going to give you one last question for our last little bit of time. Mr. Feaster, so we have people who are watching who are from Boston, but we also have people who are watching who are from outside Boston. And I wonder, for those who are tuned in, thinking and grappling with these issues of unequal access to education, and in general, racial injustice, what would you ask of people? How can people make a difference from wherever they're standing, wherever they're sitting tonight?
Well, I am sure that the persons who are viewing and participating in this program and asking these questions are what I would call the fair-minded people, the good people, who are concerned about people in society generally. The question is, there's just not enough of us. And what it will take is, and I think the last 5 years have shown that we have to begin to look at these things in our own homes, in our own communities. We need to get engaged in terms of the issues that are evident, because we have, in terms of all these racial divides in every nook and cranny of the 351 cities and towns here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And there are many folks who feel that, yes, they are good people, but there are just some things that say, well, I'm not going to respond to that. And I'll give an example, and I'm not suggesting that any of the people here fall into that particular prototype. But we had the people who said, oh, well, I can support what's going on because my 401k is doing fine, and I'm making money. And the fact that one is spewing racial issues, one is spewing misogynistic issues. Well, I mean, that person is just there. We're going to, let's ignore that. Let's move on because these things are fine. Well, you can't ignore that, because we see what the outcome is the destruction of it. And particularly, what example are we giving to our young people? If I'm going to make the assumption that they're primarily adults on the call. So we have to get engaged. The same thing that I said before, as far as my passing on the baton to the younger folks who may be in the Black Lives Matter, to the young folks who are in the auxiliary at the Urban League, the Young Professional Network. I have to set an example for them. I have to say, if something is wrong, it's wrong. It's wrong, whether it's given by me or given by anybody else. Wrong is wrong. And we have to begin to speak up, and we have to get involved, and we have to challenge wherever possible. And that's to go back to the question that you asked me, Monique, that's what drives me. Maybe it's my personality, you know, maybe it's the fact I grew up in New York, I don't know. But one of the things is this, I'm going to continue to fight and I'm going to stand for what I believe is right. And so my sense is if I can leave it with folks to say, I'm gonna quote John Lewis, let's get some good trouble. You know, let's engage in good trouble. You know, I for one, and I'll leave with this, and I can remember when Tom Atkins and we at NAACP, that had to be somewhere around 1975 or so. And this is around the desegregation, and when the busing was going on, it was the violence taking place in South Boston High and in Charlestown and other parts of the city. And they had what was the swim-in over at Carson Beach. And they had an article in the Globe because it was the 50th year, whatever year it was since that swim-in. And I remember I was at the branch, and and Tom Atkins and them and Elmer Lewis, or they even had Ola Tunji, the drummer from New York, was up here. Well, anyway, they went there and folks threw rocks at them and the police attacked them, et cetera, these peaceful folks from there. And I said to Tom Atkins, I said, I'm not going to, I can't go to the swim-in because I can't turn the other cheek. Mm. And you wanted to have a nonviolent, approach. You just want to go there and they were just going to march, et cetera, and they got set upon. That wouldn't have gone kindly. So you also have to know your own strengths and weaknesses and how there's a different role in the struggle for everybody. Mm-hmm. And what you have to do is find your place for when you're going to do good trouble.
Amen. Amen to that. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
You've been amazing.
Thank you for that reminder that we each do have a role to play. Everybody who's here has a role to play, and it is about finding out the way that we're called to do that particular role.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, I do feel that I try not to dictate to anyone and what it is. What I try to do is to set a course, and if you can follow or would desire to follow that, fine. But if you want to establish your own pathway, but as long as we're going in the same direction, if you want to go by, as that song says, go by train or plane or boat, you travel what works for you. But, we all need to be in sync for what is right for us all.
Thank you.
Thank you for laying down the path.
Thank you so much for those words.
Yes, thank you so much. You've set a path forward for many. Thank you.
I thank you for having me. I hope that I've shared something which is, worthwhile for your audience. I certainly respect the work Mary Margaret and Monique and you do in the ministry and at the church. You have, we need to be doing this on your historic aspect of what your church. Folks don't even know that you sit at the epicenter of what transpired during the Revolution, the Revolutionary War, and who lived in Roxbury at this particular point in time. Folks don't know the history, and if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat some of the negative things that transpired. So there's a great history with the work that you folks do, and I'm just pleased and honored to be able to share something this evening with your audience.
Thank you so much. And we have tours that we give to highlight the history of the John Elliott Square. So when we're all vaccinated, we hope that everybody will come and take a tour. And then we hope that you'll come and take a tour, Mr. Feaster, from some of our young people, the people that you're trying to pass the torch to. So hope you'll join us sometime in the near future where we can meet in person. So thank you again. Thanks to everybody. I see some of the words of appreciation coming in from folks who are thanking you for helping us remember that history can guide us into the future. That's from one of our board members, Lisa Snellings. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy to do it.
Yeah, have a good night.
All right. Good night now.
Bye. Good night, everyone.